again, everyone, and welcome back to All Things M365 Compliance. I'm Ryan John Murphy, Compliance Lead at Epic Global and Microsoft MVP. And today we're going to talk about insider risk management. And as always, I'm joined with Nikki. Hi, Nikki.
Hi, Ryan. Hi, everyone. My name is Nikki Chappell. I'm a Principal Cloud Architect at Cloudway, and I'm also a Microsoft MVP, both in security and Microsoft 365 apps. And today we have the pleasure of introducing you to Tatu Seppälä. Sorry if I've mispronounced your name. Welcome to you to our show today.
Thank you. Happy to be here, and don't worry, it was just fine.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, what your role is, and what your passion is about kind of Microsoft Purview?
Yeah, happy to do that. Happy to be here. A long-time viewer as well of your podcast, and I work as a security and compliance architect at a company called Sulava in Finland. My main focus for at least the last year has been Microsoft Purview and data security, insider risk, and other things. So I also have background in other Microsoft tech like Entra ID, access management, and security. Really started getting interested in data security and insider risk about 1.5 2 years ago, when a couple of my customers started really asking about that area, and we had some real business cases. And I kind of realized that this is an area where there's not that much focus, not that many people talking about it, which seemed weird because of you guys know that this is a very important area. Something of a blind spot, I'd say, for many organizations still.
Yeah.
So what was kind of driving your customers into kind of insider risk? What was their kind of real kind of focus? Why did they suddenly go from, just being the normal organizations that focus on the SecOps side to suddenly saying, actually, it's not just about the bad actors from the outside?
Well, there's a couple of different paths my customers have taken to tackling insider risk. And the most obvious one is they have some real life experience of insider activities that have at least threatened to cause harm to the company. They have a recent experience and got spooked and decided that something needs to be done. They realized that this can happen to us as well. The other path is through simple visibility. That's the benign path, I'd say. I try to guide more customers to take this path so they don't need to go realize the hard way what needs to be done. Usually it's through something coming up through auditing. A pattern maybe that comes up through DLP rule match investigations. One of the customers started noticing that it's very common for certain types of exfiltration to happen that they haven't sanctioned, and that led to interest in IRM. So that's the other path. Those are the two main ones.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. So I think from my experience with IRM, it's a great tool, okay, and it does a lot, but for customers that are not really used to that space, especially within that Microsoft ecosystem, they just feel there's just too much to do first and foremost before they start to get the right signals through. But if anybody remembers SCOM and all the thresholds that you had to basically set up and fine tune and so on and so forth, I feel there's an element to it, Tatu, where it's there, but you've really got to know what you're looking for against the users that are in your environment. And they don't have to be everybody. It can be simply populated down into policies depending on the user scope that you've got.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. There's a bit of a cliff to get started, and especially since we're talking about a tool here that, when configured without doing it exactly right, you're going to get a lot of, let's say, spam to crawl through, which can quickly lead to an overwhelming situation. So the real trick is to prepare correctly before diving in. That means we kind of do a soft landing and have the right goal for your insider risk programs. It's important. So the right mission statement, let's say, defining that before you get going helps immensely.
And when you kind of go through with the customers and kind of define that mission, who do you find what type of roles are accountable for this? Is it still sitting within the security team, or is this tended to be owned by somebody outside of that group?
Yeah, I can talk to that a little bit. It's for my customers, it's usually been the case that IT is initially the one enabling the getting going with it part. Let's say the initial pilot, the initial configuration. But after we try to bring legal and compliance teams and HR in as early as possible to get them on board with what we're trying to do and familiarize them with what we are planning to do, so they can raise any, let's say, regulatory red flags. Since IT cannot be responsible for the whole thing by themselves, they don't know everything they need to deploy IRM. So I've seen a evolution in my customers when legal and compliance have been involved for long enough, let's say over a year, and they have hands-on experience. They actually, at least at one of my customers, they actually took ownership of IRM after the first year. Once they knew the tool well enough and they knew the process and were involved for long enough. So I think there's a transitory period that you start out with IT running the show, but they move to more of a support role over time.
Yeah, it sounds about right as well, because as you've just alluded to there, there's going to be data that's accumulated by those signals and those policies that should only be visible to certain people. Now, a quick example of that, Tatu, is the fact that you can essentially elevate a policy or alerts from policy straight into an e-discovery case, okay? And having that flexible visibility of being able to do that is great, and it basically gives you that elevation through that triaging process of that particular alert. But of course, on the flip side of that, there's going to be data in there that's past the point of that policy creation or beyond the policy creation that is not privy to IT admins. It's going to be investigators, e-discovery investigators, compliance officers, and so on and so forth. Have you found that with your deployments? Yeah,
we were over the last year, especially with one customer, we were really building out the whole process of who can see what at which points. And even before we got to the e-discovery part, we realized that we need to have really rock solid role-based access controls and roles defined for different people at different parts of the process. Who looks at what? If we don't have clear distinction between those doing the triage and those doing the deep investigation and what they're supposed to be looking at, we're not going to be able to make much sense of the audit log, even on the IRM side. E-discovery, of course, is part of this discussion as well, because you start to accumulate non-pseudonymized information on that side.
Yeah.
But the cornerstones of a successful deployment so far on the roles and responsibilities side have been building out the process beforehand, documenting what everybody's supposed to be doing, setting up the role-based access controls according to that, and really defining the decision points and the criteria for those decision points in the investigation progress, from the initial alert all the way to the ultimate determination of what's going to be done.
Yeah, sure. And just out of my interest as well, because I find the Microsoft default RBAC roles, they're adequate enough to get going, okay, to essentially start that process off. And I've worked with DLP, I've worked with sensitivity label, and even down to e-discovery. Yeah. How have you found the customization of those IRM roles in retrospect of what you're wanting to do and what Microsoft gives you the ability to do when it comes to breaking down and customizing those roles?
Yeah, so far we have went with the default roles, although I do feel like I would like, ultimately, if we do things, we take things a bit further, I would like to, especially the analyst role, I would like to keep that to a pure triage role and not even involve them in any cases once they decide to escalate. That's a bit of in the default roles, you can still kind of dig around in the case a little bit, at a certain level when you're an analyst. But other than that, we haven't run into any significant RBAC customization requirements as of yet. Have you run into any?
So we trialed this out at a large global bank, okay, and they were in a very similar position to you, if not the same, if I've understood. The analyst role was adequate enough, but in some of the analysts that they had brought into the business, there was an overexposure to particular data or the signals that were generated or the alerts that were generated from the policies. Whether that can be resolved by under permissioning by creating a new RBAC group, or whether that can be resolved by asking Microsoft via a DCR to create a specific group, we do not know. However, we do know that this particular bank in question, they did try to customize those roles, but some of the permissions groups in those roles were reliant on others, just like in the e-discovery one, and they weren't able to bespoke them as much as they would have liked beyond the defaults that Microsoft had given them. Now, it would be great if you could do exactly what you could do with Exchange and deep dive right into those role groups and start to pick out whatever you need. But unfortunately, at this moment in time, as you know, it doesn't offer that. So that's my experience with that. It gives you 70 to 80% of what you need, but that last 20 to 30%, you kind of have to accept the risk and just go with it.
Yeah, that's I have the same experience in the sense that we've gotten to the point where we can do enough with technical controls that we can cover the rest with, let's say, written agreements and NDAs and by mandating people to sign up to a certain process when they conduct investigations to not look at certain stuff, even though they can. We can then cover with auditing. We can cover we can identify if necessary if those investigators have stepped outside of the bounds of their role.
Yeah.
So far we haven't had any issues with that, but of course that doesn't mean anything. We need to be able to.
No, of course.
Show it.
Yeah, of course. So building those blocks up then. So we now understand how to introduce the product into the environment, how to be able to bring out those controls, not just from a technical perspective, looking at those business requirements, looking at those regulatory alignments, and being able to essentially start, okay, here is phase one of what we would build out in IRM. And you would make it as a closed audience with very limited visibility within the actual alerts themselves. But then you've got all of these thresholds as you go through the policies, right?
Yeah.
What I found first and foremost with particular customers that I work with is those thresholds are either so far to the right or so far to the left, they really don't know how to fine tune them, right? You're either going to get a lot of noise or you're either going to get undervalue of that noise as well, without really having to plug into, is this an intentional or an unintentional event?
Yeah. Same experience. Fine-tuning, I would say fine-tuning policies is an absolute must at this point. Let's see if I can actually share something to help talk about this. But I found that I cannot deploy a single IRM policy without doing at least one fine-tuning pass. Usually it ends up taking 2 or 3 passes over time to really get those thresholds. Now that we can actually use analytics to fine-tune policies, to get those thresholds correct, so that we capture a meaningful amount of interactions without overwhelming the team, but also without making the limits so high that we receive no meaningful alerts at all. So that it takes time and it's kind of tedious, but has to be done at this point.
Yeah.
So I go over each indicator.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I end up going over each indicator, take a big cup of coffee and make like a first pass based on my own intuition at this point. And then we run with that for a few weeks, see how many alerts we get, and then we do a cooperative pass with the customer to fine tune those, see if they got too many alerts to deal with. and if not, then we'll let it roll from there.
Yeah.
So when you start this process off, would you normally start with just a key group of users within the organization? So you've got a smaller amount of users, so you're obviously the volume of alerts is going to be representatively smaller if you've only got a subset, or do you switch it on for everyone?
We do start from everyone usually, but we also usually limit it to for especially customers that are really getting into IRM. We start from data theft by departing users always, because it's such a clear scenario. It's such a clear scenario to get kind of business buy-in to the whole IRM function, where you can quickly show kind of real life value to what we're doing, what you're doing here, and the fact that the alerts are happening right before people are leaving the company gives enough context, so you have let's say far less false positives than for other scenarios. So you get a good quality signal almost every time, and you can practice your processes with this as well.
Yeah. I think from my experience as well, that has always been the low-hanging fruit, because like you say, you've already got that construct there and you already know what's happening based on the fact that somebody has resigned. So you already can narrow down that particular element and start to visualize and get all those alerts through to say, okay, this person has just resigned, but what happened the last 90 or 180 days? Okay, has there been any trends up to that particular point, or even beyond that point as well from that particular person? But when you come out of that, and then you're starting to look at more of your data assets rather than your users as assets into those policies, that's where I feel there's a huge benefit to IRM. But on the flip side, when you get those alerts, there's a huge negative. And I'll explain the difference now, is because you actually do get to be able to publish sensitivity labels and sensitive information types in there into those watch lists, if you want to call them, in those policies. But the biggest letdown I have seen, and more often than not, the reason why companies don't want to go with IRM is because all of those alerts from all of those policies are in a single pane of glass. You cannot separate them out into region or VIPs or types of data or whatever the case may be. If Microsoft were able to fix that and bring in like admin templates that they have for other solutions, or even compliance boundaries or information barriers that they have for e-discovery and throughout the M365 for Purview for SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams, I personally feel there'd be an uptake and adoption. How do you feel?
The same. Some of my customers operate in Germany, and we have to limit who is in scope of IRM to Germany is just an example. Of course, many countries have regulation that require this kind of ring fencing and administrative units type of approach. So right now it does limit what we can do, which countries we can target, even if our implementation is pretty rock solid and privacy and things like this are adequately accounted for. So it does resonate.
Okay. Just sticking with the alerts for the moment. I know IRM has a dedicated connector to Sentinel, but I know not a lot of people are actually using Sentinel at this moment in time. And we have trialed out some watch lists in Sentinel to either have a positive look at people and bring them into those alerts, or negative to ignore them. Now, it's good. It really is good, because it gives you that initial breakdown of what the alert does. But from a triaging perspective or a deeper dive in the analysis, you've then got to go back into Sentinel, where you've then got visibility to everything at that point. So again, there are some slight workarounds, but I really do feel if Microsoft were able to offer some type of boundary control or whatever the case may be in IRM, alerts could be certainly triaged or visible to certain areas.
The big consideration with Sentinel, I would say, is the lack of pseudonymization, if there is a lack of pseudonymization, because this is like my personal crusade that IRM without pseudonymization is essentially almost worthless. If you're talking about, and I'm going to explain what I mean by this. This is a strong claim, and it might be a little bit of over exaggeration in there, but what I mean by that is if you don't have pseudonymization on, it's really hard to have integrity for the investigation process, because this is a human-run tool. People are looking at other people's activities, and there are very few people in this world that are free from cognitive bias. Let's say, or other kinds of biases. Let's say you have 3 alerts, one from your best buddy at the office, one from your buddy from the soccer football team, let's say, and one is from the person who made rude jokes at your expense at the company party. You're the investigator. You have 15, let's say 30 minutes to look at an alert. Which one do you pick? You're probably not, if you have a high level of integrity, you might still look at just the evidence. But over time, humans are going to make calls not based on the evidence, but on their personal preferences and stuff like this, even subconsciously, if we don't have pseudonymization all the way. And that's what I'm kind of worried at, is that there's an option to see, once you see the identity of someone, you're going to know it. You're not going to be able to be entirely unbiased if you know the person. So that's going to affect the investigatory process. This is not something Microsoft highlights, of course. They're more focused on the tech, but an important piece.
Yeah, look, I completely agree. And I think where I've trialed IRM out, pseudonymization has been, oh yeah, that's great. But when you actually start to get those alerts through, and you want to be able to triage them and start to understand what that pseudonymized name is or who it is and what they've done prior, they simply just go and turn it off, because they need to be able to understand who the individual is, who the line manager is, whether or not they've got any other counterparts or any colleagues that they work closely with, for them to start to create that activity map of that particular user. And like you say, when you flip them into a Teams channel or in eDiscovery, you lose this pseudonymization straight there as well. Yeah. So
yeah, it's tough, because I would actually kind of challenge the fact that you would need to know the person's identity right off the bat. I would say that it's usually, we're talking about stopping data exfiltration in some way or another. I would say that it's entirely possible to run the IRM process in a way where you establish whether risky data exfiltration has happened, and if the data that's moved out in an unsanctioned way it's important enough to warrant further investigation and controlled dismantling of pseudonymization without exposing the identity from the get-go. This can be built into the process, and there can be a criteria and a decision point whether to remove pseudonymization.
So it's almost like a gated process, really. You've got one person doing that initial investigation while it's pseudo-anonymized. And then if you think there's significant enough risk, I suppose that's the point, you can say, well, maybe we now need to raise an e-discovery case, or maybe I need to hand off to another group to say, actually, now they're going to do the deeper dive, and whereby you might need to open it up. But I think it's important, isn't it, to have those clear boundaries about how far one person can go in their role.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point.
So
I started thinking about. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, with some organisation at that point, maybe the decision lies then with the HR team, for example, to say, I think there has been an incident, and at that point, it's kind of then it's an HR one, and they then get involved, or they then involve like the legal teams that would do those other things, and then it's much more, I would say, akin then to e-discovery, because you've got an investigation, you know what you've got to search for. So. Yeah.
Right. The cooperation between functions is probably, I feel like it's one of the most, it's something new. You have to build something new to make IRM work for most companies, which is the IRM team, right, Ryan? You were talking about the IRM team before.
Yes.
There's usually not this type of function, this type of working group does not exist in most companies. You have to pull people from various roles together, introduce them, introduce a common mission, and then introduce even the tools to get get the cooperation working, and a schedule, by the way, also. Yeah. So there's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, for sure. And in my experience, well, specifically just in my experience, we've had to bring in people from the DLP team, okay, and then people from the litigation side that are now not working with the legacy ways of e-discovery, but they're working with Microsoft's solution from a technical standpoint when it comes to the actual solution. So you're bringing two different worlds together in one particular application for them to be able to do each of their own pieces of work. The DLP guys setting up the policies and understanding the triaging and working through. And then, like Nikki just said, there may be another element of that now with HR to say, okay, this is unintentional, this is intentional. Okay. Then you've got that third element now, you got that phase 3 where the actual investigation now takes an extra step, and then you're basically running a discovery search against these people. That's a litigation at that point. Yeah. And these three teams are so not used to working with each other in a technical aspect. So everybody's target operating model when it comes to insider threat needs to change significantly. Now, that's a big change for an organization.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head, so to speak, right there. The goals in an insider risk investigation need to be defined pretty clearly, and the whole program. I would say the programs I've been helping build are not targeted at stopping technically the actual exfiltration itself, but rather their main goals are to give people, kind of compassionately give insiders, people working at the company, every possible opportunity to do the right thing through things like DLP policy tips and guidance, to filter out as much of the inadvertent risky actions as possible. And even after that, only go as far as revealing the identity of the individual if it can be absolutely established that what they've done is not an accident.
Yeah, it's intentional.
So determining a key component of being even able to determine intent is to get things like sensitivity labels deployed, is to get DLP in place, like policy tips and justifications, to clear up the signal so that the IRM team can make an actionable determination of intent that's realistic, like based on, but it's not a guess.
No, you're absolutely right. And even, me and Nikki were talking about this a few weeks ago when we had another guest on talking about IRM some time back. Your information protection strategy needs to be completely and fulfilled as a deployment before you even start talking about IRM. Theft by departing users, okay, I can see that as a sideline just to get some signals coming through and some alerts coming through, especially if you're an organization that relies on a lot of freelancers, or you have a lot of C-level people coming in on a subcontractual basis to help you out. But if you don't have sensitivity labeling deployed fully, and you're able to identify sites, files, emails, whatever the case may be, and your DLP strategy is strong enough so you're not getting lots and lots of noise from alerts, you've really gone through and fine-tuned your DLP strategy, then I would probably start with your earlier example, Tatu, of a very small audience, but perhaps a wider scope. Because if you look through those policies when you're building them out, you can map in DLP policies. If this DLP policy is free, if this sensitive information type is detected, if this sensitivity label is there, So I completely agree with you. That overall DLP labeling strategy definitely needs to be fulfilled.
I suppose it's about managing risk, isn't it? And that kind of pyramid, you want to be protecting your most valuable information you've got. So actually risks and alerts coming from, high risk areas, SharePoint site, team, the team files, etc. That's going to have more weight than if it's just a site that's just got public information. Because again, I think that then helps focus down and remove some of the noise, doesn't it? If you can say, if you can start putting those weights on things.
Yeah, that's noise, right? I would go as far as to say that IRM, like the main challenge in IRM is just noise. Like that's what most of what we're actually doing is trying to filter out noise without filtering out the nuggets of gold in the stream, let's say. So we really needed to do things like create custom indicator variants for, especially, we look at audit logs first, we look at things like DLP alerts and figure out what are for this such and such organization are the most common ways where people exfiltrate data through, let's say, consumer services. Which consumer services are used most? Then we create indicator variants for those scenarios. So we actually can pick up those specific scenarios from the in IRM. And usually for these custom variants, we then end up fine-tuning them really tightly. For custom variants, we can then use very tight fine-tuning where even a single or two events are enough to cause an alert.
Yeah.
And
so
that ends up
have
giving
you
us
got
a better service.
have you got a slide on that? Is it worth showing that?
Yeah, you can actually, you can show, I can
Yeah, because you've got it up on
discuss this a little bit. So in case people in the audience don't know, we can actually have a thing called custom variants where you can take something an indicator you already have, let's say the indicator for sending email with attachments to outsiders. Well, sending email with attachments to outsiders is pretty common, right? Every company does this, but you can then go and create groups of domains, for example, for consumer services that your company actually, you've seen in your audit logs, perhaps, or that you're worried about. Consumer email domains that are not part of your business. You can make a new indicator, a new variant, let's say sending email or even confidential material to recipients in consumer email services. And you can then use this in your policies to get a lot higher fidelity indicators and better alerts, let's say, through these. This has been a great success for many of my customers at this point.
I agree. I think this would cut, as you've just mentioned, this would cut a lot of the noise out, because now you're getting significant signals, but those significant signals are actually value to you. They're not just, you're not just going to have to go through 60 different signals and start to triage them out because they're exactly what the option tick box gives you, So I think as Microsoft starts to think this through and start to look at other insider threat solutions that are on the market and start to bring out some of those core configurations, but also some of these policy line configurations that what you've just shared, I do think that will start to be more attractive to people to bring that through. One of the other comments that was made to me from a different customer was the fact that it only goes back 180 days. Now, I'm not too sure if that's changed recently, but when they was looking at this, they was a bit shocked, and they said, Ryan, our current solution can go back 2 to 4 years, and we can start to bring those signals together for that particular user, sometimes from the day that they join, if they're a contractor or a freelancer, and they're able to build out this artifact on user join, here's some signals, and it was flat, and then there's some more signals, and so on and so forth. So the 180 days that they offer, it may be adequate for most companies, but when you're talking huge enterprises, it's a little short.
I think you can kind of see where see a possibility where that's maybe the solution started with data theft by departing users. One of the most key cases. There's a lot more scenarios now that would require or benefit from a wider net than just 180 days. It's true. I mean, that's enough for departing users, but it's a really good point that you require more for certain other scenarios.
Yeah. Well, hopefully Microsoft are able to bring that, because you can have a 10-year retention if you have the additional license, don't you? So if there were specifics, let's take a VIP policy, for example. Okay. Most VIPs don't spend 180 days at a business. They're there for a long time, CXE, CTO, so on and so forth. Yeah. If you're able to apply the same advanced audit retention policies to the audit log, which pretty much IRM goes and trawls through, right? Why wouldn't you be able to offer the same when it comes to the same? Because if it's there in a repository for 10 years, why can't IRM go and look at that? Right. Why can't IRM bring that across? Sorry, go ahead, Tatu.
No, it's just I was agreeing with you. Personally, I just haven't had those cases yet where we need a longer time, but now you mention it, they probably will come up sooner or later. So Microsoft, if you're watching, hit us up on LinkedIn.
I'll tag Kevin Fitzpatrick in here. I'm sure he'll be watching.
Right.
So
I was going to say, I've got a question about the kind of this refining process. So for me, it sounds like this isn't something you just configure once, switch off and monitor. You've got to be proactively monitoring and say, what patterns am I seeing? Am I seeing trends? What a lot of, if there's areas of noise, I then need to keep going back and refining it. So it's kind of, you might get, a huge amount of alerts, and you want to be filtering it down and prioritizing all of that time. So that sort of role for not necessarily assessing the alerts, but refining the alerts must just be also ongoing.
Yeah, it is. If you could actually, Nikki, put up the slide I have here, I can give some thoughts to that. So the thing we've ended up doing with my customers is building a fixed schedule that's actually booked in the calendar. We're getting into this. Some already have this and some are still building this schedule, where we have dedicated activities for every day, every week, and every month, and fine-tuning is kind of built in. So let's say every day people inside a risk triage responsibles do that, and every week we can take a little session where we go through the findings, the main findings of the week, the biggest cases, and this is the first place where analysts can bring up the if they feel like certain indicators are overrepresented or are too spammy, we can then go back and fine tune that. And every month we take these sessions where we talk about possibilities for new variants and perhaps new indicators that have come up that could be used in policies. So it's really an ongoing process. It's not fire and forget or configure and forget by any definition.
Okay. And this again looks very much like your standard DLP triaging type of schedule of every day, every week, every month. So it doesn't surprise me that most companies that I've spoken to will bring people from that DLP triaging team into the IRM world, and you'll have like a split role at that point. Yeah. So this is really good to understand. And have you had the opportunity to use the adaptive policies? Yeah, Tatu?
Only planning for it. We're in the initial stages of planning a pilot around adaptive protection, but I do have a certain point about that actually, and thanks for bringing that up. So the way we've ended up deciding to start with adaptive protection is to mostly focus on the elevated risk level, the highest risk level. And we've decided that the best way to go forward with that initially is to not set it up to trigger automatically, but only trigger when a high severity alert is confirmed for a user, when it's actually raised to a case. That way we have an initial handle on when elevated risk level is actually triggered, because we don't usually, my customers aren't at the point of maturity where they can fully trust their policies and their alert stream to be perfect enough to not cause too many true positives. So that's probably the best way to get going in a managed way with adaptive protection, I would say.
Okay.
Is to tie the elevated risk level to a manually confirmed high severity alert.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense. Rather than it triggering early and you're preventing the user from doing their job, should it be an intentional way of working for that particular user? It definitely makes sense to have that manual trigger in there as well, for sure.
Because then you can kind of tie it, even write it into your process, where you can document that when you confirm as an analyst, when you confirm an alert, these things will take place on the user's end. Such and such hardening of access controls will happen, or rather DLP policy, DLP rules will come into effect and so forth.
Okay, cool. And is there any other real world examples or key takeaways you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'm thinking of cases from the last year. Well, I would really highlight. Thing that's come up is that role-based training is actually a really effective outcome of an insider risk investigation, and I'll explain what I mean. Even though we're using pseudonymization across the board, and we rarely even get to the point where we remove that. However, quite often we can detect from the data involved that people investigated are from a certain role, let's say HR, because of the prominent types of documents they handle. And when we've run into significant amounts of alerts from people in certain roles, we've systematically started offering training on secure information handling to that entire role without targeting specific users, which has then, at least in one documented case, led to a clear reduction of, let's say, risky behavior within that role. So once again, comes back to having a kind of a compassionate insider risk program where we try to give people every opportunity to do better.
It's certainly an interesting topic. It's certainly an interesting solution. And it does always makes for a great conversation, IRM. Well, insider threat as a whole. And I know there's communications compliance there as well, but we're talking more specifically about the IRM process here today. Anything else from anybody else?
If we want to talk about communication compliance some other time, if you have a guest over, it would be really interesting to have a conversation about Microsoft 365 Copilot and communication compliance. That's like a whole another topic for another day, probably. But
sure.
The relationship, the difference between people's interactions with other people and people's interactions between an AI chatbot are interesting to explore. Not just from a regulatory standpoint in countries with communication secrecy laws. I'm following that space with interest.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there's going to be lots of Copilot conversations as we move forward, as Copilot is hopefully adopted into next year. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of data protection officers and compliance officers out there very excited, but also very nervous about Copilot's capabilities. Anything from yourself, Nikki, before we close out? Because I think we're right on time.
No, I think it's been really, really useful getting some real life examples of, how this is deployed rather than just going and reading kind of the Microsoft documentation, which is quite dry. It's having that pragmatic approach, which isn't just technology. It's all about people, process and technology, and people are the forefront of it. And I think your insights of making sure that role-based training to try and minimize the risk in the first place is like really good insight. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to jump from the audience to the actual podcast for once. It's nice to be here. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And thanks for joining us. We really do appreciate it. Okay. And that's it for this episode. And we'll see you again in the next one. Thanks for joining us and goodbye for now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.